So we should find a way to make it applicable. So we support it. We think that it is the solution. In terms of COVID, of course, it will suffer, but still it will be the solution, the best solution that we have until now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So again, when we think about SGD 16 within the context of the aim to significantly reduce all forms of violence, and we put that underneath what's taking place now in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world, as well as in East Africa, where there are rates of sexual and gender-based violence, domestic violence, and interpersonal violence that have been increasing in the face of limited opportunities for income generation, lockdowns, curtailed hours of businesses. I'd like to hear from the both of you in terms of your perspectives on how you might characterize how gains that have been made in previous years, which will undoubtedly be reported with regard to SGD 16 in 2020 as having been lost, having significant ground lost. I'd like to hear both of your responses to that. Apologies, if we could start with Hala and then go to Ambassador Kavaruganda.
I think one of the biggest traits posed, I've tried to cover that, raise that in my initial intervention. In building independent and strong institutions, of course, sits at the heart of democratization and even SDGs plus 16, SDG 16, and one of my biggest fear is that if COVID-19 continues with this pace, if it's going to cripple, the economies of the continent, if it's going to destroy social fabric and social welfare structures, and if there's a possibility of the spread of popular uprisings, riots, that's caused by the shortage of basic services, basic supplies, and increasing frustration of the mass against the government. We may the possibility of the politicization of security forces, the politicization of state institutions that should be independent, and the securitization of the overall response could undermine the public and political spaces in most countries of the continent. So, and of course, we've witnessed in many countries of our, even in Ethiopia, we've witnessed a rise in child marriages because of COVID, a rise in domestic violence, and not only that, the informal sector is usually dominated by women. So small businesses in the informal sectors are the ones that are hardly hit. So it will ruin the social welfares and the livelihoods of families who are who are dependent on daily wages. And in the long term as well, it has because of COVID, schools are closed, and we're witnessing that in some places, people are idle, they don't have jobs, they don't have school, and that's a recipe for protest and violence, both intercommunal violence and violence between citizens and state security institutions. So we are in, the thing is, it's been only a few months since we started witnessing the impact of COVID on justice, on inclusion and independence of institutions and building strong institutions. But definitely it requires further research, it requires further examination to make bold statements and bold claims, and to back it with strong evidence. But one thing for sure is it will have an lasting impact in how in how government responds to economic and social demands, but broadly as well, how it will impact society relations, both from the perspective of politics, economics, and also social issues. Back to you, Lunia.
Thank you, Hala. I appreciate that you put an emphasis on sort of what's understood now anecdotally and is understood in a general level, but that there's a need for an evidence base to be established with regard to the long-term, even the short-term impact on what's happening right now with regard to levels of violence, as well as other sort of, other areas where the social order is disrupted as a result of COVID-19. Over to you, Ambassador.
Yes, thank you, Runiga. First, we have to say that not all countries has done the confinement. We have some neighboring countries who did not do it. Of course, it affects us because as we did, we still continue to do it. And some our neighbors does not do it, or they do it halfway. So the number increased also in Rwanda because of the people coming from them. I mean, the free movement of people is not, there is no free movement of people, but the movement of goods is there. So the transporters, I mean the drivers, bring it. Second, you said that all the positive aspect that we gain on SDG 16 were lost. Or I cannot say that it is lost. It is there. We have put it in bracket, in parentheses. So when the COVID-19 will not be there anymore, we will resume them and we will continue where we have put them aside. The problem is when COVID will end. The longer it will be, the worse will be for everybody. But until now, some countries has started already to alleviate, so there is hope. But the SDGs that we have gained will not be lost. I insist that we will resume them and go ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Hala. I think we may have time for one last question. And this question is in relation to the role that women play in the peace building process and the role that women play in violence reduction, whether that's in the Horn of Africa and Rwanda. And I would really be interested in the two of you providing some responses to sort of the roles that women play in the overall consolidation of peace and how you see that taking place in both Rwanda and Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa, as well as the efforts that have been made to ensure that women are included in peace processes and are included in very specific ways in civil society engagement, and how you might then see that engagement of women, given the understanding of those actual peace builders being very directly and disproportionately affected by COVID-19 as sort of members of the informal economy, as well as those that we understand now to be very disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So again, I might direct that to Hala first and then to the ambassador.
I think, from the perspective of economics and politics, we can say that just like, normal, other disruptions, we've seen natural disasters, violence, conflict, war, displacement. It affects women and children more than it affects other parts of society. And COVID-19, as I mentioned earlier, has visibly increased, the sexual violence and domestic violence targeting women, but it has also affect the education of women. There are solid numbers coming from different regions of Ethiopia, showing that thousands and thousands of young women were forcefully married because schools were closed. And jobs, most of them, at the end of the day, in the hierarchy of the economic system, most women are in informal sectors, and even the ones in the formal sectors are the one that can be easily let go by when economic crisis happens, and that has significantly threatened the role of women in the economy, the role of women in public life, and it also is connected with their rights in the domestic affairs as well, at home as well. So, but at the same time, I think it's not all gloomy, because we've witnessed innovative and creative ways of in many parts of the country, for example in Ethiopia, a number of initiatives were created to reach out to the needy, to create strong social networks and social safety nets. Initiatives started in different places, mostly led by women. So it could also provide platform for women to respond to this societal challenge. So in a way, I believe, as I said earlier, the overall impact of the COVID-19 in inclusion will definitely be a negative one, but it could also provide new innovative ways of doing things. For example, one thing that we're still experiencing is this webinar is somehow one way or the other linked with COVID-19. A number of online events are taking place, and we are in the process of redefining work, redefining workspace, redefining meetings. And for women, working from home, the possibility of working from home could provide, some opportunities for at least the urban educated women. But at the same time, the restructuring of the economy, the rethinking of the whole economic and social structure after COVID could also provide an opportunity to rethink patriarchy and to come up with a more inclusive economic and social structures. I'll stop there. Back to you, Lunia.
All right, thank you, Hala. Over to you, Ambassador.
And you are aware that in Rwanda, we are the first country in the world to have a big number of women in parliament, I think with 64%. So here again, the role of women in the peace building is crucial, is important, and we have to support it. For the reason that Mr. Hallelujah has explained, because the women are the first victims in this conflict, in this violence. So we need really to have women, a big number in peace building. So in our peacekeepers in Rwanda, we try to increase their number to have at least 30% of them, because we know that the people who will see them will feel more comfortable, especially if it is women and children. They like more to deal with women than men. And I think that it's quite universal. Everybody agrees with it. The role of women in the peace building is important. More than that, the word is even small. It's crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kavuganda. I'd like to take this moment now to end our panel discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists who highlighted some very interesting challenges as well as opportunities that we have within COVID-19 to sort of rethink some approaches to peace building and other mechanisms. I'd like to thank again our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Ambassador Guillaume Kavuruganda and Hallelujah Luli Wandimu. Apologies to everyone for Dr. Jonas Adai. Unfortunately, he has succumbed to one of the issues that we do have on the continent, which is power goes out quite often. So unfortunately, he was unable to join us. But again, thank you to all of our panelists for their participation today. I also would like to extend a thank you to my RUSI colleagues that created this forum for today, with special mention for Andrew Chi. And finally, thank you to all of the attendees and those that asked questions. Please stay tuned for the next session.
Thanks so much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrew Yao Chi, a Senior Fellow for Africa Security at RUSI. For those of you just joining, we've had 4 outstanding sessions, and this final panel discussion is a topic which is close to my heart. On this last panel, we'll be discussing the role of SSR, DDR, and peacekeeping in Africa. On today's panel, I have the pleasure of opening this session with His Excellency Heva Lados, former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations from 2011 to 2017. His Excellency has held a broad range of positions in France's Ministry of Foreign Affairs since joining in 1971. After having served as Deputy Director General of the Department for the Americas, he was appointed Charge d'Affaires in Haiti, before then becoming Deputy Permanent Representative to United Nations in New York. Our second panelist is Dr. Cedric de Koning, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI for short. Cedric has over 30 years experience in research, policy advice, and training in the areas of conflict resolution, peacekeeping, peace building, and conflict studies. Our third panelist is Dr. Jedi Okehi, who is the Regional Program Coordinator for Africa at the UNDP. He previously worked as a non-resident Senior Research Fellow at NUPI. He has worked as a consultant for the Institute for Security Studies and led the African Union Commission's Policy and Development Agenda for peace support operations in Africa. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Michael Zhao, who is the Principal Research Analyst at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the former Director of the Africa Research Group. He previously was a Senior Research Analyst covering Central Africa at the FCO and an advisor to peacekeeping training centers in Kenya and Rwanda. And finally, Dr. Peter Albrich, who is a Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. He focuses on the field of security, peace, and development. His research examines reforming military, police, intelligence, and judicial actors. He also focuses on how security as a public service is being provided by state and non-state institutions in Africa. So without further waiting, I'll open the floor for remarks from His Excellency, and then we'll move to Cedric, Jedi, Marco, and Peter before we open the session for Q&A. Your Excellency.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for convening this very interesting meeting. Given the shortness of time, I will just stick to a very few ideas. First, generalities about peacekeeping. You know that, of course, the bulk of United Nations peacekeeping operations have been for many years concentrated on Africa. And of course, with all the difficulties we have seen, but also with a measure of success when you compare the situation in Western Africa in the early 2000s with that over the last several years, you can only note that there has been an improvement definitely in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. So I think it is not, it has not been, contrary to what many say, a failed project, but on the contrary, it has met with a degree of success. But of course, we know the situation in DRC, in Central Africa, in Mali remains very complicated. Now, of course, one of the main difficulties has been that you have seen on the ground a proliferation of non-state actors in front of states which were failing, if not completely failed. And of course, to the people, the very first proof of the pudding is in the eating, I would say, as the British would say. The very proof of the existence of the state lies in its capacity to protect people and goods. If they fail to do that, then of course it is a failure. So one of the basic lessons I think we have learned in a hard way has been the absolute necessity to regain, for the state to regain its credibility, through, in particular, security institutions doing at least the basic job that is expected of them. It's necessary for the population, and let's not forget, it's also a necessity for foreign investors who are legitimately looking for a degree of security for whatever operations they are planning in that particular country. We have a saying in my country, in French, that wisdom comes with a fear of the gendarme, fear of the police, say. And that is indeed why the security sector reform is so essential in so many of those countries. Take the case of the Central African Republic, where in the 70s, even already, it was commonly said that the authority of the state stopped 10 kilometers from Bangui, from the presidential, or at that time, imperial palace. So a lot of the job is to decide, of course, in very close link and cooperation with the government, what shape is going to be the police, the army, and of course with very heavy choices. When I was in charge of peacekeeping at the UN, I have great doubts, I remember, and I talked about it with President Johnson Sirleaf at the time, whether Liberia really needed to have an army. After all, it is a country which is under no foreign threat, and maybe there could have been creative ways with regional neighbors like the Mano River countries, or maybe under ECOWAS, to find defense arrangements which would have allowed the country to do without an army. And to a degree, there were the same hesitations in Central African Republic. What is certainly in every case necessary is a police that is loyal, that is respectful of human rights and legality in every way, that is properly trained and that can do the job. That, of course, necessitates training. It necessitates more often than not salaries, because very often the countries cannot afford to pay for well-trained police. And then different shapes can be found, whether conventional police, whether the gendarmerie model, which has been perhaps more familiar to countries with a French background or Francophone background, but certainly very necessary. And then, of course, how to articulate that with the realities on the ground. I'm sorry. And there, of course, DDR is a very big challenge when after the worst is over in a crisis, in a given crisis, when you have to decide what to do with those people who have been fighting all over the place, whether they can be vetted, whether their loyalty can be ensured towards the institutions, towards the government. So this has been a very difficult choice, for instance, in Central African Republic, as indeed in some cases in Mali. A few more points. One, of course, has to do with the necessity for the security apparatus in a larger sense to have more access, or access at all, to a minimum of intelligence and technology. In my time in New York, we developed the introduction of up-to-date technology, nothing very fancy, but having air surveillance drones, you know, in Eastern Congo, in Mali. That was really, I think, a milestone in our capacity to know and to help, of course, the governments and the institutions to know what was happening on the ground, and intelligence even more so, and intelligence wherever possible on a regional basis. in the case of the Sahel P5, this has certainly been a crucial thing. And when I mention regional cooperation, of course, I just make a few comments, if I'm still on time, about the role of the African Union and the various regional institutions. They play a critical role in advising, in supporting, in informing all the processes. But of course, they face a severe limitation of technical and financial means. And depending on the regions on the African continent, you cannot but notice a very big difference between ECOWAS in Western Africa, which is a very up-to-date and rather performing organization. But in other parts, the International Conference on the Great Lakes, which has very, very limited manpower and very limited means. So I think there is more than ever crucial need to call on the support of the African Union and the various regional organizations to contribute to the extent they can. And of course, to open all these sectors of SSR and DDR to the intervention of other actors. I'm thinking either of national actors, certainly, well, the country I know best, France, has been very active in countries like Mali or Central African Republic, but also organizations like the European Union, which has devoted a lot of effort and a lot of money to train the new security institutions in Congo, DRC, in CAR, and it's going to continue to do that because I think there is expertise, there is money, and there is also political capital. Never forget that the European Union is not just a big checkbook, it's also a political actor, which has a possibility to contribute. So maybe, Dr. Andrew, I'll stop there. Already maybe exceeded my time. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. So I'll head now to Cedric.
Thank you very much, Andrew and colleagues. A real pleasure to be with you here and with all our participants as well. I thought I'd use a couple of minutes to talk about three perhaps very basic or fundamental points, depending on how you want to frame it, but also issues that I think are deeply systemic and challenging when it comes to DDR, SSR, and peacekeeping. Firstly, the importance of always recognizing and orienting our work behind the principle that for sustaining peace to be self-sustainable, it has to be locally led and locally owned. Peacekeeping operations or the work we do around DDR and SSR will not lead to a self-sustainable peace if the majority of the people, the key stakeholders, the major groups in a country or in a region is not committed to that program. And I think this is very important because it means that when we think in terms of the international role, the role of the African Union or the United Nations, etc., it means we need to align ourselves into a support role. And we need to be very selective and careful and, in a sense, apply a lot of self-restraint in terms of the way we present or share or promote certain models. I think that our core role has to focus on helping to build local resilience. It could be at the community level or sub-regional level or regional level, national level, if you like. Social cohesion and adaptive capacity. This is really where our main focus should be. And that takes me to the second point I wanted to emphasize, and that is the need for a whole of society approach when we think in terms of DDR or SSR or peacekeeping. We know, and we often state ourselves as well, that there's no military or security solution. to these situations, and yet we so often fall back into that frame. And whilst we acknowledge that politics is primary, that we need to have all a mission or a DDR or SSR effort directed by a political strategy, we know also that people can't eat politics. So we need to go beyond that. We need to have a broader whole of society approach. I think this also relates very much to kind of the broader stability or stabilization approach that we have these days, and the understanding, the situating of ourselves in a comprehensive or whole of society approach to stabilization, to DDR, to SSR. Perhaps Gide will talk about the Lake Chad stabilization strategy that I know UNDP is supporting and that the African Union and other colleagues have worked with. And I think that's an excellent example of a strategy that attempts to do a whole of society approach that involves local communities, local authorities, regional governors, and link them up to national and regional and international partners in that process. And the last point I wanted to emphasize is that DDR and SSR especially is not technical. It is deeply political and socially connected. And it means that whatever we do, and especially DDR and SSR, has to be part of a larger political agreement, a post-agreement settlement, a larger framework, because if we deal with those in isolation, then we create a kind of a self-myth of transforming things which are not really transformed because the larger system that they are in is still the problem. I think this is very important, for instance, when it comes to the police that Mr. Latsous has emphasized. We know from many of our experiences that if we have a very well-performing police in a system that is systemically corrupt, we are just going to have a very well-performing corrupt police force, and they're going to be better at corruption than before. So we need to be very conscious, I think, of that systemic approach and what that means, what in terms of actually challenges for us. It means, I think our essential task in this context is to help a community to reach a point where the majority of people, groups, stakeholders have accepted or recognize that violence as a tool to pursue their interest is unacceptable, is not useful, is not sustainable. And therefore, our work in support of communities as the international community, as peacekeepers or as partners working on DDR and SSR, I think need to essentially either enable those institutions, social institutions and society that are working towards peace, or we need to disrupt or contain or constrain those actors that are still in favor of using violence. So I think I'll end again with my emphasis on our role needs to be one that is in support. And I think for me, the most important element there is that we need to be really focused on integrating a do no harm approach into our work, so that we make sure that we are not, following our own timetables or for other reasons doing certain things which will actually contribute to the next conflict or lay the foundation for a lapse in conflict into the future. So I think my overall message is a very cautious approach, one that has to follow national and local counterparts if we're going to be working towards a self-sustainable peace. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Cedric. And over to Jedi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrews, and thank you very much to all the organizers of this very interesting panel. I think a lot has been said already, and my intervention would focus on some key lessons, in my view, on SSR within the context of not just peacekeeping, but the broader agenda of sustaining peace in Africa. And I offer 5 reflections, some of which I think Cedric and Mr. Latsous have already touched upon. The first reflection is that investment in security spending is global. It's not one that is or ought to be limited to the African context. And it's part of this whole comprehensive approach for promoting peace, especially in fragile states. And the reason why I say that is that if one looks at global military spending, for example, it constitutes at least 2.2% of GDP. In fact, in Africa, there is a paradox in terms of the analysis of on military spending. States that are relatively peaceful, such as Namibia and Lesotho, have one of the highest in percentage terms expenditure when it comes to military spending vis-a-vis their GDP. But when it becomes a problem in the African context is when armed conflict drives volatile military spending. And exactly that's the point, or that's the problem we are seeing in regions such as the Lake Chad, the Sahel broadly, but also in the Horn of Africa. And often this sort of military spending has a detriment on other critical development sectors. The second point, which I think Cedric already touched upon, but which I really would want to unpack further, is that the security context in which reform of the security sector occurs requires and necessitates that it is embedded within what Cedric called a political strategy. I would argue that it has to be embedded within a political process. And in unpacking politics as an important component of the security sector, what do I mean by that? I think I mean two broad things. The first is that often we see in the literature is often defined as a political process. But what that means in practice is that SSR is at the center of state sovereignty. If, for instance, we define the state as having a monopoly over the use of force, right? What it also means is that conducting SSR has the capacity to reshape state security functions, especially in relation to who currently benefits from such security. And ultimately, the political content of SSR presupposes that SSR could lead to a reconfiguration of existing power relations. And it's on the basis of that there's often an emphasis on the political content or component of SSR. The second broad aspect when it comes to the politics of SSR has to do with the necessity of embedding it within a political strategy. I think if one looks at some of the efforts that are faced challenges in terms of trying to reform the security sector, for instance, in Somalia, what you'll find there is that there is an absence or challenges in relation to forging a political consensus through which a security sector reform could be conducted. And on the basis of that, we often see that in cases like Somalia, we have faced significant difficulties through the mission of the African Union in trying to undertake a successful security sector reform. In other contexts like Burundi, it has not been sustainable because the political process there has not necessarily been one that is based on accountability and effective, embedded within rule of law. The third lesson, which I think is important, and I think again, some of the discussions here have already been held, is around risk. Oftentimes we tend to see SSR as almost leading to sustainable peace, but with the type of missions that we are deploying today, and as Cedric mentioned, we're seeing that increasingly we are deploying stabilization missions. This could inherently pose some risk to SSR. And the reason why I make this argument is that, of course, the aspiration or the key critical end state of most of the stabilization missions that we deploy are expected to promote short-term stability within the context of a different type of security threats. And as a result, SSR in this context, so for instance, if you look at MINUSMA or in fact the MNJTF or AMISOM, is often aimed at addressing immediate threats, such as violent extremism, and also SSR being done to effectively conduct counterterrorism operations. That is not sufficient. What we really need to do is to ensure that SSR is being conducted within the context of long-term governance and institutional building agenda. That is often missing in SSR programming. And here I submit that it is only when SSR is constitutive or embedded within this broad long-term agenda that we can achieve the end state that we seek in terms of sustaining peace. The fourth point is around an exit strategy. SSR depends, quite frankly, on the alignment between security and development. We often say that there is no military solution or no security solution to the crisis we face in Africa. What we really need to do is not just to invest exclusively on SSR programming, but rather it must be embedded within a long-term vision for peace building in any security environment or any post-conflict environment. So for instance, in Liberia, as Mr. Lassus mentioned, it is not so much about the quality of security institutions. That is important. But what we also need to focus on in a country that has a growing young population is to focus on the quality of jobs that are often being provided to these communities. And that could also be a way of long-term conflict prevention. The last point is something that has also already been mentioned around national ownership. I think by national ownership, we should avoid using this as a mantra or a legitimizing tool for external dominance. Rather, I submit that national ownership should mean that security policies, institutions, and activities within a country must be designed, managed, and implemented by local actors. I think that is perhaps one of the most important takeaway from this session. And of course, you cannot do that in isolation of the international community. But when international actors need to support, and this is an important point to raise, it has to be well coordinated. We find that there are often a proliferation of external actors trying to achieve an objective around the reform of the security sector. But in the medium to long term, what that does is a fragmentation of the security sector. So this is very important, this alignment between what the external actors are expected to do in a coordinated way in support of a national effort. So in conclusion, I would submit that effective SSR, in my view, has to be situated within the broader agenda of peace building and governance, because SSR in itself is an important element of promoting effective governance. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And we move to Marco. Marco, sorry.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all. That's really, really great. It's a pleasure to be here, part of this eminent panel. And I like to think that what I'm about to just touch on actually speaks to exactly what's just been said by His Excellency Ladsu, Julia, and Cedric. And so I'm going to just touch on the issue of COVID, not in a huge way, but only in the sense that what we're seeing now with this crisis, which is unprecedented, is actually exposing and exacerbating some existing dynamics. And when I'm thinking about security sector reform in the context of peace support operations, as has been said by all three speakers, touching on institution building, touching on local ownership and the realities at play, it needs to be underscored by the political context and by contextual realities. So in these circumstances, as Jide just said, and Cedric, stabilization missions, whether it's UN or AU, SSR occurs and SSR programming occurs during or after conflict. and delivered in partnership with various multilateral and national agencies, the UN, the AU, host nations, donors, and regional states and organizations. But it speaks to the need to understanding what drives building a security sector. And that really is speaking to civil-military relations, what I call civil-military relations, understanding the political realities of a defense and security sector in any specific state related to the national and local realities of that state. And that is very, very complicated. You know, that's not simply about paying salaries or training a couple of battalions or police units. That's trying to relate an institution to the underlying politics, the history, the sociology of the society at large, which includes those things like identity issues and power dynamics of the state. So how does the security sector, well, how can it function effectively in practice? And of course, that's not just the regular armed forces, but as has been said, the police and other institutions around the security sector, but also the nature of governance and leadership and politics of that state. And if we're talking about military integration and DDR, that also speaks to the interests and identities of those non-state actors that are part of that security sector reform process that will be integrated into a national defense sector. So it speaks to this wider concept of institution building and essentially state building, you know, led by the United Nations and partnering organizations like the African Union. And as I said, it's much broader than just technical issues, but how do you develop cohesion of the security sector in what it's supposed to do? And when I look at some of the countries that these issues are affecting, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Somalia, Mali, but also Afghanistan, you know, it's not limited to Africa by any means. Latin America has gone through some of these processes. It all speaks to the same issues about civil-military relations. And DDR is part of this. And as Jide said, there is this inherent tension between externally imposed models and locally contextual actors who know this stuff. And when the externals leave, it is national actors and local actors who will be living with this situation. So I think it's really important to just have that concept of civil-military relations in our minds. And when we think about COVID-19 right now and the existing challenges to PSO and SSR, there are strains to peacekeeping missions at the moment because of this current crisis. Rotations and forced generation of the mission have been paused, both UN and AU. There have been some repatriations. There's some restrictions because of host nation requirements to counter the virus. And this has an impact on developing security sector reform programs, training and mentoring. Can forces actually conduct those activities in theatre? Also, pre-deployment training has been halted. So there is this impact right now. And there will be budget cuts. Those countries that fund the UN, that fund SSR programming have been hit economically. So I think it's really important to understand some of the constraints facing the wider peace building global systems at the moment because of COVID. So going forward, what's the impact? I suppose the maxim hope for the best and plan for the worst is probably the best way to approach things. And it may be too early to tell actually what the impact is. And it's likely to end at some point, whether it's 1 year in the future, 2 years in the future, the crisis around COVID will come to an end. So part of it is putting into place contingency plans in the short term, especially around budgets and how to plan with the limited resources that these missions and actors have. So I think this COVID issue exposes what needs to be done anyway. And looking at that, what I would suggest is, or thinking about, is that the security sector reform actors, peace support operations, and everyone in the peace building system needs to be predictable and reliable and provide predictable and reliable support to nations and entities going through a security sector reform process. And that's the UN, that's the AU, that's donor states as well, and regional organizations, whoever it may be. But to work politically with the context of the issue of the civil military relations notion at the center of security sector reform programming, and to empower the host nations to actually achieve their national action plans on security sector reform. Perhaps in the short term have sort of COVID crisis assessments, COVID working groups, basket funds to try and avoid any impact from budgets, but longer term mainstreaming the politics of security sector reform and of civil military relations into security sector reform, and to take that holistic approach that Cedric was just outlining, and use partnerships of internal and external expertise, and expertise from those countries within universities, within regional civil society organizations like the ISS in Africa, or ACORD, or IPSS, or academics, or whatever it is, as well as in-house SSR and political expertise from the missions. And then to build upon AU approaches, if we're looking at AU missions, to build upon UN approaches to security sector reform. So what I think is that it actually exacerbates some of the really important dynamics at play. And there's an opportunity to try and revisit some of our approaches to security sector reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Peter, you're still muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me? I think you can. Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, also for this opportunity, both to you and Rusi, to talk here. And I think I just want to pick up on Marcus's point about COVID-19 and whether it's actually sort of pushing some agendas forward that were already sort of like current, because I think that's very much the case. I think there's been a lot of discussion about COVID-19 and what it's doing to peacekeeping. And I think a lot of sort of the gist of a lot of that conversation is about less money, make it more focused, and making it smaller and more manageable. And I think all these discussions are really taking place within the framework of peacekeeping. So basically the idea that peacekeeping should persist in such a sort of a form, a shape that is recognizable, but just smaller. And as Marcus said, I think it's really, I mean, all the discussions about the lack of funding and peacekeeping being under pressure, really these conversations have been going on for quite some years now. And with Trump coming into power, that was really one of the big debates about peacekeeping, whether it should be, what would happen to peacekeeping now that the threats about and lack of funding to the UN was becoming a reality from the American side. I think at the same time, I think also when we talk about ruptures, we talk about them as something negative, but we also have a tendency to sort of talk about them as a sort of like exaggerate the opportunity inherent to a rupture like COVID-19, that actually everything is falling a little bit apart, so something new will come out of that. And I always wonder whether that's the case. I mean, I think when we talk about conflict and the implications of conflict in many countries, you will see a lot of reviews saying, right, this is an opportunity to really redefine gender roles in a country because there's been a conflict, everything has collapsed. There's this sense that there's really, you know, it's a space that is waiting to be filled. And I think we should always be cautious about having this idea that there's nothing really there, which makes it easier to build something new out of conflict. At the same time, of course, because there is consensus internationally about the opportunity that COVID-19 may also give to redefine what peacekeeping and peacebuilding should be. I think maybe there is that consensus globally, which is quite unique because we are all in this to an extent experience the COVID-19 to a greater or less extent, all of us. So maybe there is this consensus internationally about redefining what it is that we're actually doing. So I would suggest, I think it's very difficult to come after these four esteemed experts, and I think it's difficult to say something new, obviously. So let me just try to say two small things here. I think the international community should give more thought to not to how to do less of what they usually do, but about the limitations of what the international community can actually achieve. And by the international community, I mean what external actors from abroad, usually from, of course, from Europe and North America, but also other parts of the world, what they can actually achieve with the models that they have available to them. We have plenty of examples of externally driven processes that have made comprehensive momentary change that may not have stuck in the long term, but nevertheless have made changes in the short term. And I think Sierra Leone, where I worked quite extensively, is a very good example. There was a massive peacekeeping mission, more than 17,000 troops in the early 2000s, and which was the biggest at the time. And at the same time, the Brits, the UK, started a big security sector reform process in the country that was also considered very comprehensive and sort of a, I wouldn't say a blueprint, because what does that actually mean? But definitely there were some best practices coming out of the process. I won't go into the detail of the security sector reform process there, but just think about what actually then is Sierra Leone facing right now, and how deep do these processes actually go? If we say that security sector reform in Sierra Leone, which was a very small country, where there was quite unanimous sort of, there was at least one direction from the UK in terms of doing security sector reform, then how deep do these changes go? And I think one of the things that you can see definitely in Sierra Leone at the moment is that there is a quite heavy, it's a significant politicization of the security sector. So there is a history, of course, of using the security sector for political purposes. And that's the case in many parts of West Africa. And you really see how the police is used more to a much larger degree to basically sort of serve the interest of the government at any one given time. So clearly that idea about what the police is and what type of state Sierra Leone is and how it should be governed has not been changed. The reason why I'm saying this is that if we talk about it changing institutions and we talk about making them more democratic and accountable, then actually we do not have these really, really good examples of places where that transformation has truly taken place to an extent where we can see that they are not under pressure today. And I think that's really something to keep in mind. I think we need some historicity in how we're talking about these things and really think about what is it actually that these external interventions can do and what are the limitations. I think there's too much discussion about actually that it's just not done good enough, well enough. We have to do it in a different way. We have to rethink how we do it, but are we really rethinking the models that we're using? And I think that's definitely one thing that I don't see a lot of, and because there are many reasons for that. I think one of them is there's a political economy around interventions, and there are a lot of interest at stake in this. So therefore, actually really questioning what it is that we're doing, I think it's also quite a difficult and very politically fused and sensitive thing to do. And I think then, for me, it's also, so the second point that I would like to make here is that international organizations are really, I think, very, very bad at recognizing alternatives to some kind of a centrally governed Weberian type state. I think it's never really clear what we talk about when we talk about Weberian states. I think it's very much about, you know, what we talk about, sort of the monopoly of violence, basically, right? The instruments of violence. So that's what we say, what many people mean when they talk about the Weberian state. But really, there's a quite sort of intricate bureaucratic system that goes with this type of political entity, and is really building up that system that really is, of course, the huge challenge, and also, as I just alluded to before, quite difficult still to do. But I think what we are notoriously bad at is to really question our models and question what it is that we actually think the end state is. Because we can talk about national ownership, we can talk about accountability, we can talk about involving the national or local population, however you want to say it. But at the end of the day, if that still means that we have a clear idea about where we're going with our intervention, then clearly that is not really allowing something endogenous to really sort of be established. And I think daring to go to a place where you're actually not having an end state in mind, a clear idea about where this is heading, that is something that is also extremely difficult to do for the international community. But I think in a way it is necessary, because again, the challenges of going out into the world with a clear mindset on where we're going, or where a process should be developed, and what the end state is problematic. Yes, I think that's it for me, actually. So thank you, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. I mean, just to quickly, not necessarily sum up, but just to, I mean, we've mentioned keywords like support, locally led, the sort of topic on risk and the level of risk, long-term, wider agenda for peace. But I guess the question comes back to this for me, which is really about, and I think something that Peter touched on, are we really, to a degree, are we putting too much emphasis? And Cedric, maybe you can come in here, but this idea that it needs to be local, but actually a lot of the times that we have too much emphasis on how this state should look like, as in this is how it works from a Western perspective, maybe, for example, and actually we want the countries to look like this. And so actually what we end up doing is going wrong on this. Is actually, I mean, if you look at the Sahel, it's nothing but weapons left, right, and center. And actually that maybe we haven't got this right and that we need to rethink. But also, as Marco has said, is this a time to honestly rethink the way in which SSR, DDR is done in Africa, considering that we are likely to face these cuts? And I don't want to use the word COVID, but I am going to, because obviously that is the sort of buzzword at the moment. But considering the impact that it's going to have financially, I guess the question is, we've talked about better synergy, but the reality is, do we need to rethink this? And if we do, what does it look like? Because I think that's, I know, Cedric, you've mentioned local, but what does that look like in this new time, or this potentially new time?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good question. I think it is probably one of the fundamental questions. I think, of course, the advantage of COVID-19 is if COVID-19 does mean major constraints on international engagement, that kind of creates the gap or the vacuum which the international community used to fill in the past and are no longer perhaps able to do that a couple of months down the line, which means national actors, local actors are going to have to fill that space and have to take more responsibility, whereas in the past maybe they were quite happy to sit back and benefit from the political economy, as that Marcus mentioned. But maybe now this will force them to take more responsibility. So I think that's maybe one hopeful positive side effect of COVID-19. I think we know for sure by now that over emphasizing, over domineering the institutional makeup, the models, imposing models don't work and actually undermine self-sustainability. So that we know. Then the question is, okay, but what do we do when we have protection mandates or when there's conflicts or there's a kind of a stabilization impetus? Let's say Europe wants to avoid migration and it wants to avoid export of terrorism. So there's those interests. I think the one thing we know as well when it comes to stabilization, especially if I think in the big stabilization missions like Mali and the Congo and so on, is that the analyzation is that you are working with a legitimate partner who is facing an insurgency and you're helping them to counter that insurgency. But what if you are not working with a legitimate partner? What if you're working with one set of elites that have captured the state? Then I think we are just serving that elite and playing into the birth of a new conflict. And so I think we need to be much more cautious about what kind of situations do we get ourselves in terms of security sector reform and peace operations framed as stabilization. So my general message is, one of caution, one of stepping back, one of restraint, one of allowing politics to take its course, processes to take its course, and perhaps our role as external actors, as the UN or the African Union and so on, is much more to prevent the situation from crossing certain red lines. And within that sandbox, we must let the situation develop itself. And there's certain parameters that we want to prevent certain level of violence and so on, where we maybe have a legitimate role to play. But I think we really need to take our hands off the sandbox and allow the internal politics to play out. That is, I would say, the core of what I take out of that question and that approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in here? Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. I completely agree with what has just been said. I would add one comment. After all, at the end of the day, what it's all about, it's about the rule of law. It's reintroducing in a given country, which has been outside of that for so many years or decades, allowing that country to live again under some legal framework with institutions that allow for that, institutions that are to a reasonable degree honest and loyal, not corrupt. So that is really what we are seeking out to provide. That brings me back to my earlier point. It's just being back to the basics, going back to the basics, allowing the local people to live in a modicum of safety and security for themselves and their property. Then, of course, you have to factor in, because the threat very often comes from private actors who are smuggling, whether drugs, whether precious minerals, whether human beings. Then you have to factor in working customs service, a forestry service, maybe a wild game service in some cases. But it's all about the very basic rule of law. So that, I think, is something, even with all the constraints from COVID and from over recent years from fiscal constraints, I think it is a necessity because otherwise credibility will not be there in the light of the local communities. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to come in on this? Okay, slightly moving on. You'll go over it, Peter. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, it was just I think it's interesting, this idea about letting politics run its course. But I think one of the difficulties of these processes is also that you're trying to change how resources are distributed, how they're controlled, who has access to them, and also there's also sort of development dimension to this, obviously. So if you let politics run its course, you're also allowing those who have power already to really sort of, do what it is that they sort of usually do. And I think, so I don't know if it's for external people, external organizations, institutions, what have you, actors to do something about it, but there's definitely something about changing how accountable, how uncorrupt these institutions are as well, so that more people in society actually benefit from them. And I think that's also a discussion to be had, because I think it sounds good when you say let politics run its course, but it has a lot of implications, especially for those people who are not in a position to let politics run its course by them. So that's just what I want to say.
Marco, go for it.
I'll just very quickly, I just want to agree with everything that's been said there, and Peter's issue about the political economy of interventions, I think, is spot on. And the different approaches to developing SSR. I mean, if I look at the Great Lakes states, the countries of the Great Lakes region, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, DR Congo, they're very different in the ways they've developed their national defense sectors, and they sort of demonstrate some of these issues. So I'm not passing judgment on them, I'm just observing. And the way that, for instance, Rwanda and Uganda have developed their own militaries and defense sectors has been entirely locally, nationally driven. And, some would say very, very effective. They're now, large contributors to peacekeeping missions, so keeping security in other states. Whereas in Burundi and the DRC, they've had much more of an externally driven SSR process, which has been sort of played in certain areas for the different political interests that play that political economy piece of the interventions. And I know there are huge differences in terms of the time in history that these different developments of the security sector took place. The size of the country in the DRC compared to the size of Rwanda, for instance, it's very, very different. But it is very interesting just to see how countries like Rwanda and Uganda, who didn't have a very, very large externally driven SSR process, have managed to develop effect, if I can use inverted commas, in terms of territorial integrity and their own political governance systems, which may be alien or different to ours, but seems to work, and then the externally driven ones. And to me, it just speaks of how the security sector reflects politics and how it's a symbiotic relationship. And it's going to continue to be that. And I think, for instance, in Rwanda, the defense sector is going to reflect what happens with broader governance issues, political development, liberalization, or whatever it is.
Brilliant. We have another question, or a question from the audience, which is from a gentleman called Ewan Grant. And the question reads as follows. Dr. Lados referred several times to the CAR, Central African Republic, and closed pointing out that the EU is a political actor. Is this a reflection, the question asks, of a concern in Brussels, Paris, and beyond about Russia's growing presence in the CAR and long-term Russia and Chinese presence in countries which are of source of new strategic minerals?
If I may provide some elements on this, I think that first it is good that countries like China have become contributors, and indeed important contributors to peacekeeping. They are now, the Chinese, I mean, the largest troop contributor amongst the P5, and I think this is a good thing. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's not so much a matter of competition between this or that group of country and another. It's a matter of seeing what people can contribute in a disinterested way. Or maybe there is not such a thing as disinterested, because there is always an interest. And let's face it, when my country, when the EU intervenes in northern Mali or in CAR, it's not gratuitous. It's not just outright generosity. It's also because we have a stake in curtailing drug trafficking in the case of Mali, in curtailing jihadism and terrorism in several places, in curtailing flows of migrants. So there is that. But I think Russian interest in CAR is maybe something that is not absolutely critical. If that Russian Federation can actually help that country move ahead, then I think it's not bad. It is positive as long as it is coherent with the overall approach of the international community, as envisaged, as summarized in the Security Council resolutions that are relevant to the case. Thank you.
I'm going to ask, Raphael's asked the question, but I'm going to ask him to sort of be a bit clearer on several, because he's asked 4 or 5 questions, but very wide. But so I'll ask the question, and hopefully Raphael by then will ask the question. And the question for me, I guess, is given the types of training that are going on, particularly training African armies across the continent, and the underpinning that actually a lot of the political, elites are running these systems, is there something that we need to be doing there about this? I mean, as in the way we approach this, particularly because in some states, for example, we are seen to be propping up exactly, or there's the same regimes that we actually claim that we want to reform moving forward. Jelly, do you want to take that? You're muted.
Thanks. In terms of training, I think there are about 2 broad set of issues. The first is technical, all right? There's a technical challenge here, which is related to what sort of training standards do we have to subject our security institutions to? What sort of training models are they exposed to? And this is linked to the previous conversation around, the role of external actors, where we find that if one takes, the Sahel or even Somalia as an example, where you find a number of actors that are working to support national security institutions, right? In a way that are not necessarily coordinated. What you eventually find is that there are different personnel that are trained in varying degrees of standards. And this is often a problem when it comes to defining the technical capacity of these national security institutions. But the more important problem, I think, is or challenge here is a political one. And in defining the capacity of security institutions, the question around what these security institutions are used for becomes very important. Are they used to maintain a particular regime, or, as Cedric mentioned, elites in power, or are they actually used to protect and govern citizens? I think this is one of the points that we continue to face when it comes to the nature of training that our security institutions are faced with. And I think for so long, we have often confronted this problem without necessarily addressing them. And that is why, in my view, I wouldn't think about an SSR model. I think it is, we risk going back to the traditional set of problems that SSR have faced. Rather than think about models, I'll think about principles that should govern or underpin the security sector reform in a fragile setting. I think because all context would always be very different, right? And on the basis of the political process, and the political process is not an end in itself. The political process has to be predicated on the ability of national stakeholders to forge a political consensus. And it is only by forging such political consensus that they can actually agree on the nature of their security institutions. And this is exactly what the problem that we're facing today, where there is an inability, or there have been persistent problems in terms of how we're able to forge a political consensus amongst key stakeholders in both the center, amongst the federal government in Mogadishu, but also amongst the federal member states. And so I think we should not see the political process that should drive or underpin effective security sector as one that is an end in itself, but it should be constitutive of how we can reach a consensus for the implementation of effective reform in the security sector. Over.
Cedric, I know you wanted to come in on there.
I think Gidi has said most of what I wanted to say. I just really like his idea of principles, and I think that is maybe a way forward that we work around a set of principles for security sector reform and larger engagement around stability and security, and that this is something that partners and the host nation and all should sign up to, and that can then be a guiding framework against which one can assess and evaluate progress. Because I do think that in reality, what happens, of course, is that those partners that provide the training end up providing what they can provide. So it becomes a supply-driven exercise. It's really about diplomacy, about military diplomacy. It opens up access, it opens up leverage. So the reasons why training is done is very different from why training may be necessary or what may be in the best interest. So I think a principled approach like that could be a very interesting next step or a way forward. Thank you.
Peter.
Your question was also whether it's a problem that we're propping up, sort of supporting governments that in some people's eyes are also not seen as legitimate, right? That was also part of your question. And I think, of course, it's a huge problem that interventions have gone from being somewhat in a neutral space to now being seen as supporting one party over the other, no matter which party is then being supported. And I think Mali is a good example of that, with the UN and the AU in Somalia, of course, is an extremely good example of that as well. And I think it's one of the things that has stunned the UN in peacekeeping, in terms of peacekeeping. It has undermined sort of its authority in doing peacekeeping, and there's been a crisis of identity because the UN is deploying in contexts that are extremely dangerous and where certain groups are more on the front line of this mission than other countries are. So I think there is a lot of, and I think that is an ongoing process both within the UN system and at the international level about what are interventions developing into, but just to answer your question sort of very clearly, I think it is a very big problem and issue, and one that is clearly undermining also the authority with which external actors can engage to an extent, not 100% of course, but to an extent, and that is something that has to be dealt with in a way that hasn't been dealt with thus far.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So time is not on our side and we have a few more minutes. So what I'm going to ask is from each panelist, maybe if you start from reverse order, if you could give me one key takeaway that you would that you'd put forward given what we've discussed, but particularly in this time. So over to Peter. I'm putting you on the spot, though.
Wow, yeah, I'm like putting me on the spot, like, so thank you. No, but I think what I said, sort of my first point really is like, I think having a really sort of a discussion that goes away from policy lingo and sort of the idea about there's certain ways that we're doing business and we should just adjust it rather than change it. Having that honest, if the COVID-19 could sort of throw up some sort of open up that space to debate and discuss in a more sort of on what you call normative way, I think that would be an extremely important step to take, because I think a lot of interventions have been tried for a long time, and they are not necessarily sort of giving the results that we would expect. Sorry to be very uneloquent on this, but it's your fault.
Marco, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, on the spot, right. I suppose three things that just come to mind immediately is to be cautious, you know, like Cedric has said, in everything, reflecting that political economy of interventions that Peter put forward, absolutely. Investigate absolutely everything, be very, very cautious, but also not to expect results overnight, not to expect results in the next year, 3 years. I mean, if you take a SSR plan, you need to think, how long is it going to develop a cadet from the age of 18 all the way till they retire at, you know, a full sort of general level and police and other equivalents. So this is long-term stuff. And to focus and to prioritize, you know, the rule of law, as His Excellency was saying, you know, I think that is something that is international and doesn't matter where you're from. I think everyone needs to respect the rule of law, depending what form that law takes and the context it's applied to.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Okay. From my side, Andrew, thank you very much for inviting me. And I take one point out of all our discussions, and it's the mutually reinforcing nature of security and development, right? And how ultimately, by promoting security and in parallel development in an interrelated manner, what it does to sustaining peace. And oftentimes we see both tracks as operating in parallel, but increasingly, and with the nature of the security challenges that we face today, there is no way we can be deploying, you know, security interventions on the ground without pursuing medium to long-term development. And that's precisely what we've started in the Lake Chad with the implementation of the regional stabilization strategy for the Lake Chad. And I welcome collaboration in this regard from others, including research institutions. Over.
My next, Andrew, thanks. Yeah, thank you very much from my side as well. I think two things for me stand out. The one is that the peacekeeping operations that have been, I think, most successful are the ones that had this neutral third-party role. And I think we need to maybe have an international debate again about what is the appropriate role for an international organization or a regional organization when it comes to intervention in conflicts, and renegotiate or re-arrive at a common understanding of what we think that role is. And then secondly, I would say, and I think it's important to make the shift from thinking in terms of a kind of engineering metaphor of building and fixing, to think more in terms of a kind of a gardening or nurturing metaphor, right? We are supporting processes, we are influencing processes, we have no control over those processes, we can nudge them in a certain direction. And I think the more we think of our role in those terms, perhaps the more we will have the right humility in how we approach these things. Thank you.
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. I think the word used just now, humility, is a very apt one. Clearly, whatever the dreams we may nurture, we have to be realistic. We have to be cautious, yet at the same time retain a degree of ambition. After all, it's about helping rebuild countries, or build sometimes almost from scratch. So we need to have the right balance between humility and ambition, and hope that resources will remain available, because it is not only in the interest of the host country, but also in our interests in many areas. So, well, it's a matter of balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this session. I would like to thank our guest speakers, His Excellency Heva Lidus, Dr. Cedric de Koning, Dr. Jedi Okeke, Dr. Marcus Jow, and Dr. Peter Arbich for your insightful discussions, and for the audience for your questions as well. Up next, we have our Director General of RUSI, Dr. Karen von Hippel, who will make her closing remarks.
Thank you, Andrew. Excellencies, ministers, and friends, thank you so much really for joining us today. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to be with you. I know you've been this is our longest webinar so far. We've never been able to captivate so many people for 6 hours before. And I don't want to get in the way of going to relax if you're in the UK, at least on this lovely warm day, or if you're somewhere else. But I just want to make a few quick comments. I think it's fantastic the way we've been able to have so many people from across the continent, the European continent and the African continent, join us for this event. And in a sense, that's one of the positive sides of lockdown, is that we're able to expand our participation, and we learn from so many people versus trying to drag everybody to London. So we are planning, like probably many of you, to continue these types of virtual events. Some will be hybrid when we're back in the office, because it just expands our learning so much. And hopefully it'll expand our dissemination as well. I was really impressed by the various subjects that you covered. Some I'm quite passionate about too, and have worked on for many years. And I'm really glad we're able to dig so deeply with so many experts. So hopefully most of you will be open and willing to work with us to do joint research, to do future events. We can think of a lot of follow-through ideas that we'd like to do. So thank you to all of you. Thank you particularly to the speakers and the chairs today. I know it's a lot of work and it's not always easy, and technology lets us down no matter where you are. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Brenhurst Foundation in particular for supporting not only the African Security Fellow, but also other support they provide to RUSI. I also wanted to thank our RUSI team here in London and in Nairobi. I know they've been working really hard to pull this together. It was the first time we've done this, as I mentioned, such a big event, and I know that they were very nervous about it, and I'm really glad it went well. And then finally, of course, thank you to Dr. Andrew Yao-Chi, who is our first Senior Fellow for African Security and the Obasanjo Fellow. And he's really been the brains behind this whole event. If you want to know more about what we're doing on this subject or other subjects, please do go to the website. and just watch this space for more on African security issues. So a huge thanks. And if you can all join me, my favorite part of these things, if I can find the bloody, where is it, little clap button? Uh-oh, I can't find it on this thing anyway. Okay, we'll just do the big clap together. Thank you, everybody.